Ibrahim Traoré, a 38-year-old African leader, takes the podium, not for a speech, but to reveal secrets that could shake nations. After an enigmatic meeting with Putin, what has he learned about France that the world needs to know? Hold your breath. If you are attracted to revelations that challenge established power and stories that reveal the hidden depths of geopolitics, this is the space for you. Consider subscribing so you don't miss any details of the narratives that promise to change your perspective on the world. The air in the makeshift press room in Ouagadougou was charged with a palpable electricity, a mix of anxiety and feverish anticipation that hung thick over the local journalists and the few international correspondents who had managed to arrive in time. The announcement of a special address by Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso, made just hours beforehand, had set off a fuse of speculation. But what made this event particularly explosive was the context. Traoré had recently returned from a secret and widely talked about meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Rumors about the content of the conversation between the two leaders had already been circulating heavily in diplomatic circles and in intelligence forums. Some suggested military cooperation agreements, others spoke of strategic economic partnerships. Yet no one seemed prepared for the nature of the revelation that Traoré was about to make. A revelation that promised not only to shake already tense relations with France, the former colonial power, but also to expose an alleged secret plot with profound implications for the sovereignty of Burkina Faso and potentially other African nations. When Captain Traoré, with his youthful expression but marked by the seriousness of the moment, entered the room and walked towards the simple podium, an almost reverent silence took over the room. The cameras focused, the microphones were adjusted. He carried with him not only the weight of leading a nation in crisis, but also the burden of information that, according to his closest advisors, was extremely serious. Information that he felt he had a duty to share with his people and with the world. His speech began calmly, almost formally, thanking the press for their presence and reaffirming his government's commitment to transparency and the uncompromising defense of national interests. He recalled the challenges facing Burkina Faso, the fight against terrorism that was ravaging the Sahel region, endemic poverty, and the urgent need to build a future of dignity and prosperity for all Burkinabés. But there was an underlying tone in his voice, a gravity that foreshadowed something more. Then the tone changed. Calmness gave way to restrained but powerful indignation. Traoré began to talk about his recent meeting with President Putin, describing it as a frank and revealing conversation between leaders of nations seeking a more multipolar and just world. He did not go into detail about all the agreements reached, but focused on one particular aspect of the conversation. Information he had been presented with, corroborated by multiple intelligence sources, about what he described as a secret plan orchestrated by certain circles of power in France. The room held its breath. Traoré, looking directly into the cameras with an expression that mixed determination and profound sadness, began to lay out the contours of this alleged conspiracy. He alleged that behind the facade of cooperation and development aid, France was actively working to destabilize its government, undermine Burkina Faso's sovereignty, and keep the country in a state of perpetual dependence, thus ensuring continued access to its natural resources and maintaining its geopolitical influence in the region. The accusations were explosive and direct. Traoré mentioned alleged attempts to co-opt local political and military figures, to finance opposition groups in order to foment internal discord, and to use certain non-governmental organizations as fronts for espionage and subversion. He spoke of a deliberate strategy to prevent Burkina Faso from seeking new international partnerships, especially with nations like Russia, that could offer alternatives to the model of cooperation imposed by the former metropolis. The Burkinabe leader did not present any concrete documentary evidence at the time, saying that it would be revealed in due course and through the appropriate channels, so as not to compromise sources or ongoing investigations. However, the conviction in his voice and the seriousness with which he treated the matter were undeniable. He painted a grim picture of neo-colonial machinations, of a power that, unable to accept the loss of its former empire, was resorting to clandestine tactics to maintain its dominance. The mention of the meeting with Putin, in this context, took on a new meaning. It was not just a diplomatic rapprochement, but a strategic alliance forged in the face of a perceived common threat. Traoré implied that Russia, by sharing this sensitive information, was positioning itself as a defender of African sovereignty against Western interference, a narrative that would certainly resonate in many hearts and minds on the continent. Traoré's speech was an act of calculated defiance, a high-stakes gamble. By publicly airing these accusations against a power like France, he knew he was inviting a storm of denial, criticism, and possible retaliation. But he seemed determined to press on, believing that the truth, however painful, needed to be told so that his people could understand the true nature of the challenges they faced, and so that the international community could witness the pressures under which his country was being put. The courage was palpable. The previously silent press room was now abuzz with incredulous murmurs as Captain Traoré continued his speech, each word falling like a hammer blow on the already shaky foundations of Franco-Burkina relations. He did not limit himself to general accusations. He began detailing, with disconcerting precision, specific examples of actions that he said were evidence of French interference and an attempt to undermine the authority of his government, painting a picture of treachery and duplicity that shocked those present. Traoré mentioned, for example, the sudden interruption of essential aid programs, disguised under bureaucratic pretexts, but which coincided with moments when his government was making sovereign decisions that displeased Paris. He spoke of the pressure exerted by French diplomats on leaders of neighboring countries to isolate Burkina Faso regionally, and of disinformation campaigns orchestrated through certain international media outlets aimed at discrediting his leadership and portraying his government as unstable or illegitimate. One of the most sensitive points in his presentation was the allegation that France was covertly hindering Burkina Faso's efforts to acquire military equipment from sources other than France or its Western allies. This, according to Traoré, was a deliberate attempt to keep the country dependent on France for its security and to prevent the Burkinabe army from becoming strong enough to effectively combat the terrorist groups that were plaguing the nation, thus perpetuating a cycle of instability that would justify the French presence and influence. The implications of these allegations were profound. If true, they would not only constitute a serious violation of Burkina Faso's sovereignty, but would also cast doubt on the sincerity of France's commitment to the fight against terrorism in the Sahel. Traoré suggested that for some circles in Paris, regional instability could paradoxically be a tool for maintaining control and access to strategic resources, an accusation of geopolitical cynicism of the utmost magnitude. The Burkinabe leader also addressed the issue of the country's natural resources, such as gold and other minerals, whose exploration concessions have in many cases been favorable to French companies. He suggested that part of the secret plan would involve maintaining this status quo by preventing Burkina Faso from renegotiating contracts on a fairer basis or seeking partners who offer better terms, thus ensuring that the country's wealth continues to flow predominantly abroad. The reference to the meeting with President Putin in this context became even more significant. TRAORÉ made it clear that the search for new alliances, including with Russia, was a direct response to the perception that France was not acting as a genuine partner, but as a force seeking to perpetuate dependence. The rapprochement with Moscow was presented not as an ideological choice, but as a pragmatic necessity in the face of the veiled hostility of the former colonial metropolis. As TRAORÉ spoke, the gravity of the moment could be felt sinking in. Journalists scribbled frantically in their notebooks, trying to capture every nuance of the accusations. They knew they were witnessing a historic moment, a turning point in international relations that would have repercussions far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. TRAORÉ's courage or audacity in making such revelations was undeniable, regardless of the ultimate veracity of each allegation. He concluded this part of his speech with an appeal for national unity and popular vigilance. He asked the Burkinabe people not to be deceived by false promises or attempts to divide the country. He stated that Burkina Faso's sovereignty was non-negotiable and that his government was determined to defend it at all costs, even if it meant facing hostility from foreign powers. His voice, though firm, carried the tone of one who fully understood the risks involved. The exposure of the alleged French secret plan, based on information that TRAORÉ claimed to have received in part during his meeting with Putin, put France in an extremely delicate position. Regardless of the veracity of the allegations, the mere fact that they were made publicly by an African head of state and in such detail was already causing considerable damage to Paris's image and credibility on the continent and around the world. The stage was set for a diplomatic firestorm of epic proportions. TRAORÉ's words would echo through the corridors of power in Paris, Brussels, Washington, and Moscow, forcing reactions, denials, and possibly investigations. The leader of Burkina Faso had thrown a grenade onto the geopolitical chessboard, and the world now waited with bated breath to see where the shrapnel would land and who would be hit. The immediate reaction to Captain TRAORÉ's explosive speech was, as expected, a wave of shock and disbelief that swept across global capitals. In Paris, the French government was taken aback by the bluntness and detail of the accusations. The Élysée Palace and the Quai d'Orsay quickly mobilized to formulate a response, aware that silence or blanket denial would not be enough to contain the damage caused by the Burkinabe leader's words. The first French statements were of vehement denial. Official spokespeople called TRAORÉ's allegations unfounded, fanciful, and irresponsible, suggesting that they were part of a disinformation campaign orchestrated by powers hostile to France, in a clear allusion to Russia. Paris reaffirmed its commitment to Burkina Faso's sovereignty and the fight against terrorism in the Sahel, and deplored what it saw as an attempt to undermine the historic cooperation between the two countries. Yet behind the facade of indignation and assertive rhetoric, there was genuine concern in French government circles. The accuracy of some of TRAORÉ's allegations, even if interpreted in a distorted way, touched on sensitive points in French policy in Africa, such as the management of aid programs, the sale of military equipment, and the role of French companies in the natural resources sector. There was a fear that even if the secret plan as a whole was a fabrication, some of its elements might have a grain of truth that would be difficult to refute completely. The explicit mention of the meeting with President Putin as the source of some of the information added a layer of geopolitical complexity to the crisis. France found itself not only confronted with accusations from an African country, but also caught up in a broader narrative of rivalry between the West and Russia for influence in Africa. The diplomatic crisis with Burkina Faso thus became a new front in this global dispute, with implications that transcended bilateral relations. In the United States and other Western capitals, the reaction was one of caution. While there was a natural tendency to support an ally like France, there was also a recognition that relations between Paris and its former African colonies were often tense and problematic. American and European diplomats were watching the situation closely, concerned about regional instability and the risk that the crisis could open up more space for Russian or Chinese influence in the Sahel. Meanwhile, in many African nations, TRAORÉ's speech was greeted with a mixture of admiration for his courage and concern about the possible consequences. Leaders in other African countries, while perhaps sharing some of TRAORÉ's grievances about French policy, were hesitant to publicly endorse his most explosive accusations, fearing reprisals or the destabilization of their own relations with Paris. There was a delicate balance to be maintained. African public opinion, however, was less restrained. On social media and in popular debates, support for TRAORÉ was massive. Many saw in him a new Thomas Sankara, the iconic revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso assassinated in 1987, who had also challenged the neo-colonial order and defended African sovereignty. The narrative of a young military leader standing up to a foreign power on behalf of his people resonated deeply with Pan-Africanist and anti-imperialist sentiment. The international press devoted extensive coverage to the case, with correspondents trying to unravel the veracity of the allegations and analyze their implications. Some Western media outlets tended to echo the French narrative, portraying TRAORÉ as an impulsive leader or a pawn in Putin's game. Others, however, especially those with a more critical perspective towards the West, gave more credence to the Burkinabe leader's words, seeing them as a legitimate symptom of African discontent with neo-colonialism. The question of evidence, or the lack thereof at the time of the speech, was a central point of debate. Critics of TRAORÉ argued that such serious accusations could not be made without concrete and irrefutable evidence. His supporters, on the other hand, argued that the clandestine nature of such plans made it difficult to obtain documentary evidence, and that the word of a head of state, based on intelligence information, should be taken seriously. TRAORÉ's promise to reveal more details in due course kept expectations high. Regardless of the ultimate veracity of each specific allegation, Ibrahim Traoré's speech had already achieved an important goal: to place French policy in Africa under intense and uncomfortable scrutiny. He had succeeded in setting the international agenda and forcing France to defend itself against accusations that went to the heart of its identity as a post-colonial power. The secret plan may or may not have existed in the form described, but the perception that it did was in itself a politically significant fact, with the potential to redefine relations. Captain Traoré's statement, with its explosive revelations about the alleged French plot, triggered a series of chain reactions that extended far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso and France. Regional African organizations such as the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and the African Union, AU, suddenly found themselves facing a crisis that tested their mediation capacity and relevance on the continental stage. There was growing pressure on these institutions to take a stand, but the complexity of the situation required caution. Some ECOWAS member states, especially those with stronger historical and economic ties to France, expressed concern about the escalating rhetoric and called for restraint on both sides. They feared that the crisis could further destabilize a region already weakened by terrorism and coups d'état. Others, however, especially the military regimes that had recently come to power in countries such as Mali and Niger, expressed solidarity with Burkina Faso, seeing in Traoré's speech an echo of their own grievances against French influence. The African Union, for its part, issued a vague statement calling for dialogue and respect for the sovereignty of all member states, but avoiding taking clear sides. The AU, often criticized for its ineffectiveness in continental crises, was internally divided, reflecting the differing alliances and interests of its members. However, behind the scenes, AU diplomats were working to facilitate channels of communication between Ouagadougou and Paris, seeking to avoid a complete breakdown in relations. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, Traoré's speech galvanized popular support for his government. Spontaneous demonstrations broke out in several cities, with citizens expressing their repudiation of perceived French interference and their support for the captain's leadership. The narrative of a small, courageous country standing up to a neo-colonial power resonated deeply with national pride and the desire for full and effective independence. Traoré emerged, for many, as a national hero. However, there were also dissenting voices within Burkina Faso, although they were often silenced by popular fervor or fear of reprisals. Some political analysts and members of the opposition questioned the timeliness and veracity of Traoré's revelations, suggesting that they could be a ploy to divert attention from the country's internal problems, such as the security crisis and economic difficulties, or to justify excessive rapprochement with Russia. The international human rights community was also following the situation with concern. There were fears that nationalist rhetoric and accusations of conspiracy could be used as a pretext to suppress domestic opposition, restrict press freedom, or justify human rights violations in the name of national security. Organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch called for transparency and respect for the rule of law. France, for its part, continued its diplomatic counteroffensive, seeking to discredit Traoré's allegations and reaffirm its image as a partner for Africa. The French president and other senior officials increased interviews and contacts with African leaders, trying to isolate the Burkinabe government and prevent the crisis from spreading. There was a concerted effort to present Traoré as an unreliable leader, manipulated by Moscow. The question of the veracity of the information Putin allegedly provided to Traoré remained at the center of the debate. Intelligence experts questioned the nature and reliability of the information, suggesting that it could be part of a Russian influence operation designed to sow discord between France and its African partners. Russia, for its part, maintained a calculated silence, letting Traoré's words echo on their own, but without explicitly confirming or denying its role in the revelation. What was becoming increasingly clear was that the crisis went beyond the simple bilateral relationship between Burkina Faso and France. It was part of a global context of reconfigurations of alliances, competition between great powers, and the assertion of the global South. Traoré's speech, whether entirely accurate or partially exaggerated, had touched a raw nerve, revealing the deep fissures and resentments that marked post-colonial relations. The world awaited the next steps. Traoré had promised more revelations and evidence in due time. France had promised to defend its honor and interests. Regional and international organizations were struggling to find a way to de-escalate the situation. But one thing was certain: the geopolitical chessboard in Africa had been irreversibly shaken, and the consequences of this tremor would be felt for a long time to come, redefining the future of the continent. While the diplomatic storm unleashed by Captain Traoré's speech continued to shake international relations, another crucial aspect of the situation began to attract the attention of attentive observers. the potential impact of the revelations on the internal stability of Burkina Faso and on the cohesion of the Sahel region, already so battered by conflicts and humanitarian crises. The exposure of an alleged secret plot involving a foreign power such as France had the power to exacerbate existing tensions and create new fault lines. Within Burkina Faso, nationalist fervor and popular support for TRAORÉ were undeniable. But there was also a risk that this mobilization could devolve into a witch hunt against anyone perceived as a collaborator with France or a critic of the government. Civil society organizations, independent journalists, and members of the political opposition, who already operated in a restrictive environment, feared that the climate of suspicion and heightened patriotism could lead to an even greater repression of fundamental freedoms. The narrative of an external enemy plotting to destabilize the country, while it might initially rally the nation behind its leader, also risked oversimplifying Burkina Faso's complex internal challenges. The security crisis, fueled by jihadist groups and ethnic tensions, the endemic poverty, the lack of opportunities for youth, all these problems had deep roots and could not be attributed solely to foreign machinations, however real those might be. There was also the question of the relationship between Traoré's military government and the traditional political parties, many of which had been ousted from power after the coup. Some of these parties, while perhaps sharing the criticism of French policy, were also wary of Traoré's growing rapprochement with Russia and worried that the country was trading one form of dependence for another, potentially more dangerous in the long term. Traoré's speech could deepen these divisions. In the Sahel region, the crisis between Burkina Faso and France added another element of instability to an already extremely volatile scenario. Neighboring countries such as Mali and Niger, which were also governed by military juntas and had adopted critical stances towards France, tended to align themselves with Traoré. This created a bloc of anti-French nations in the heart of the Sahel, which worried not only Paris but also other regional and international actors who feared a power vacuum or the further penetration of extremist influences. Other countries in the region, however, such as Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal, which had more cordial relations with France and the West, were concerned about the radicalization of the discourse in Ouagadougou and the risk of contagion. They feared that the instability in Burkina Faso could spill over into their territories, or that the crisis could undermine regional cooperation efforts to combat terrorism and promote economic development, which depended in part on Western support. The very fight against jihadist groups in the Sahel, which was the original justification for the French military presence in the region and for security cooperation, could be affected by the crisis. The distrust between Burkina Faso and France and the possible reduction in cooperation in intelligence and military operations could create gaps that could be exploited by terrorist groups, with disastrous consequences for the local populations, who were already suffering immensely from the violence. Traoré's promise to seek new security partnerships, especially with Russia, also created uncertainty. While some saw this approach as a way to diversify alliances and gain more effective support in the fight against terrorism, others feared that the entry of actors such as the Wagner Group, known for its brutality and predatory activities in other African countries, could further aggravate the humanitarian situation and human rights abuses in the region. Therefore, beyond the diplomatic spectacle and the bombshell revelations, there was a human and regional dimension to the crisis that could not be ignored. Traoré's words, exposing what he considered a secret plot, not only challenged a foreign power, but also stirred a hornet's nest of complex internal and regional dynamics the consequences of which could be profound and lasting for the stability and future of millions of people in the Sahel. The Burkina leader, in taking the risk of making such revelations, shouldered not only the responsibility of proving his allegations, but also of managing the complex repercussions of his words, seeking to unite his country, stabilize his region, and find a path to a future of sovereignty and security that was not built on new forms of dependency or the exacerbation of internal and external conflicts. The task was monumental. As the world digested the implications of Captain TRAORÉ's speech and France struggled to contain the damage to its reputation, a new chapter in the saga began to unfold, centered on the Burkina leader's promise to present, in due course, the evidence to support his accusations about the French secret plan. This promise hung in the air like a sword of Damocles, keeping tensions high and fueling a flurry of speculation about the nature and force of these future revelations. In the corridors of power in Ouagadougou, a small and highly trusted team under TRAORÉ's direct supervision was working feverishly to compile and analyze the evidence. This evidence was expected to include intercepted documents, testimonies from defectors or informants, audio or video recordings, and intelligence analyses provided by international partners, notably Russia. The complexity and sensitivity of this information required careful and strategic handling. The decision about when and how to release this evidence was crucial. A premature or poorly planned release could compromise sources, weaken the impact of the revelations, or even be discredited as a fabrication. On the other hand, too much delay could be interpreted as hesitation or a lack of substance in the allegations, undermining the credibility of TRAORÉ and his government. The timing and format needed to be right to maximize impact. There was also the consideration of the target audience for these future revelations. Would they be presented solely to the Burkinabe people as an account of their leader? Or would they be shared with the international community through forums such as the United Nations or the African Union, seeking formal recognition of alleged French interference? Each option had its advantages and disadvantages, and the choice would depend on TRAORÉ's strategic objectives. France, for its part, was bracing itself for what could be a new wave of accusations and trying to anticipate possible scenarios. Teams of legal experts and crisis communication specialists were analyzing TRAORÉ's statements, seeking to identify weaknesses and prepare counterarguments. There was also an effort to discredit in advance any evidence that might emerge, classifying it as part of a Russian disinformation campaign or as manipulation of facts. The international intelligence community was also on high alert, with agencies from different countries trying to obtain information about the nature of the evidence TRAORÉ might possess. There was particular interest in understanding Russia's role in providing this information and in assessing to what extent it was authentic or fabricated to serve Moscow's interests. The war of narratives and counterinformation was reaching a new level. For the people of Burkina Faso, the wait for the evidence was a mixture of anxiety and expectation. Many believed their leader's words and waited impatiently for their suspicions about French machinations to be confirmed. Others, more skeptical, hoped that the evidence would be strong enough to justify the seriousness of the accusations and to dispel any doubts about the legitimacy of the government's stance. TRAORÉ's opportune time became a phrase loaded with meaning. It could be a matter of days, weeks, or even months. Some analysts suggested that TRAORÉ might be using the promise of new revelations as a means of continued pressure on France, keeping Paris on the defensive and buying time to consolidate his own power and alternative alliances. Others believed that he would only make the disclosure once he was absolutely certain of the strength and impact of his evidence. Regardless of the timing, the release of this evidence, if it were to occur and if it were convincing, would have the potential to rewrite the history of Franco-African relations and expose neocolonial practices that many suspected existed but that have rarely been brought to light with such force. It would be a moment of truth, with unpredictable consequences for France, Burkina Faso, and the entire African continent. Ibrahim Traoré's legacy would therefore depend not only on the courage of his initial denunciations, but also on the substance and credibility of the evidence he had promised to present. The world waited with bated breath for the next act in this geopolitical drama, aware that future revelations could confirm one of the biggest scandals of international interference of the century, or, alternatively, expose the fragility of the accusations of a leader under pressure. The truth, as always, remained shrouded in shadows, waiting for the moment to be fully revealed. The search for truth amidst power games and state secrets is a complex and often dangerous journey. The story of Captain Traoré and his denunciations of France reminds us of the importance of vigilance, critical analysis, and the courage to question official narratives. What do you think the future holds for this tense situation? If you are drawn to stories that reveal the inner workings of power and explore the depths of geopolitics, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and activate the bell. Your like is an incentive for us to continue investigating and reporting on the events that shape our world. Leave a comment below with your opinions and predictions. We appreciate your viewing and hope to see you in our next analysis.